Hidden human colony emerges now and stuns galaxy by taking a solar system. The alarm tore through my quarters before I even opened my eyes. 3 short bursts, then a long one. That pattern only meant one thing on Kalen's reach. Something had found us. I was Daniel Voss, commander of the small defense fleet that guarded a colony most of the galaxy did not know existed. I rolled out of my bunk, pulled on my jacket, and ran through the narrow metal corridor toward the command deck, my boots echoing against the hull plating. My hands were already shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the strange thrill of a moment I had trained for my whole life and never expected to actually see. Grace Milburn, my second in command, was already at the main console when I arrived. Her face was pale under the blue glow of the monitors. "Talk to me," I said, sliding into my chair. "A scout ship just crossed into the outer belt," she said. "Not ours. Design signature does not match anything in our records." My stomach tightened. For 300 years, our ancestors had kept this system hidden, cloaked relays, silent trade routes, a culture built entirely around not being seen. And now, in one quiet moment, all of that was in danger of ending. Could it be a mistake? A drifting probe? I asked, already knowing the answer would not be simple. "It changed course twice, to avoid our outer minefield," Grace said. "That is not luck. That is a pilot who knows what a minefield looks like." I stood and walked to the window that looked out over the docking bay, where our small fleet sat quiet under the dim light of our dead star. 6 cruisers, 2 carriers, a handful of fighters. It looked like nothing compared to what I had read about the great fleets of the wider galaxy, the ones our ancestors had fled from long ago. "Wake the Elder Council," I said, quietly. "No system-wide alert yet. I do not want panic before we understand what we are facing." Grace nodded and moved to the comm station. I stayed by the window, watching the stars, thinking about the stories I had grown up with. My grandmother used to tell me about old Earth, a place none of us had ever walked on, a place torn by wars and hunger before the first ships left. She told me how the first settlers had reached this dead system, expecting to build a new life in open cooperation with other worlds, only to learn a hard truth. The wider galaxy was not welcoming. It was a hierarchy, and new arrivals who showed strength too early were often erased before they could grow. So we hid, not out of weakness but out of patience. We built quietly. We traded through masked couriers. We grew our numbers in the shadows of an unremarkable star system nobody wanted to survey. It worked, for 3 centuries, until tonight. "Commander," Grace called, "the scout ship has stopped. It is holding position at the edge of the debris field." "Show me," I said. The screen flickered to life with a grainy image, sharpened as our systems cleaned the signal. The ship was sleek, plated in a pale silver material I did not recognize, with markings that looked almost like feathers etched into the hull. Not one of our own designs, and not anything listed in the old records passed down from Earth. "It is just sitting there," Grace said. "Watching." I felt the weight of every eye that would soon be on this system, even though right now only one ship watched us. I thought about waking the whole colony, sounding every alarm, preparing for the worst. But something in me held back. Fear made people reckless. I needed calm heads first. "Patch me through to Elder Hartman," I said. A moment later, the old woman's voice came through the speaker, steady, despite the early hour. "Daniel, tell me what you see." I explained everything, the scout ship, its careful navigation through our defenses, the way it now simply waited instead of retreating or attacking. There was a long pause on the line. "They are testing us," Elder Hartman finally said. "Watching how we react. This is not an accident, Daniel. This is the beginning of something we have feared for 300 years. Do we hide the fleet? Power down the outer stations?" I asked. "No," she said, and her voice was firm. "If they have found the edge of our system, hiding deeper will only delay the moment, not prevent it. We must decide, finally, who we are going to be." I looked back at the screen, at that silver ship sitting quietly in the dark, patient as a predator, waiting to see if its prey would run. "Keep the fleet on standby," Elder Hartman continued. "No aggressive moves. Let them come to us on their own terms, if they choose to come at all. But Daniel, prepare everyone. If this is what I think it is, our silence is ending tonight, whether we want it to or not." The line went dead, and I sat there for a moment, staring at the image of a ship that did not belong to us, sent by people we had never met, from a galaxy that had once made our ancestors so afraid that they chose to disappear rather than be seen. Grace touched my shoulder. "Orders, Commander?" I took a breath, steadying myself the way my old instructor had taught me years ago, back when this was only a drill and never something real. "Wake the fleet crews," I said. "Full readiness, but no lights beyond standard patrol patterns. I want us calm, not frightened. If they are testing our nerves, we will not give them anything to see." Grace moved quickly, relaying orders through the quiet channels we used for internal communication, channels built specifically so that no outside listener could easily catch our signals. Around the station, I imagined lights slowly clicking on in crew quarters, sleepy pilots pulling on flight suits, technicians running system checks with hands still trembling from sleep. I thought of my father, who had commanded this same fleet 15 years earlier, before a routine patrol accident took his life near the outer asteroid fields. He used to tell me that the day would come when the galaxy found us, and that when it did, everything we believed about ourselves would be tested. I never understood what he meant until this exact moment, watching a stranger's ship sit silently at our door. "Commander," Grace said suddenly, "the scout ship is moving." I turned back to the screen. The silver vessel had begun to drift, not toward us, but away, retreating back the way it came, slow and deliberate, almost lazy in its pace. "Are they leaving?" I asked. "Looks that way," Grace said, though her voice carried no relief. "But Commander, before it turned, it released something, a small object, low power, drifting toward our outer relay station." My pulse quickened. "Show me the object." The image sharpened into a small metallic sphere, no bigger than a training drone, tumbling gently through space toward one of our oldest relay posts. "Could be a weapon," Grace said quietly. "Could be a message," I answered. "Either way, we need to know before it reaches the relay." I ordered a small recovery craft to intercept the object, well before it came close to anything vital. My hands stayed steady on the console, though my mind raced through every possibility. An attack disguised as curiosity, a probe meant to map our defenses, or perhaps, and this thought unsettled me more than any weapon could, an actual attempt at communication from whoever had found us. The recovery craft reached the object within the hour. Its pilot, a young woman named Lucy Hartman, Elder Hartman's granddaughter, reported back with a voice tight with nerves. "Commander, it is not a weapon. It is some kind of recorder, audio and visual, looping the same signal over and over." "Play it," I said. A strange language filled the comm channel, smooth and layered, almost musical, followed by a rough translation, generated by our old linguistic systems, patched together from centuries of intercepted signals we had quietly studied from a distance. "We have observed your system. Your defenses are notable for an unlisted colony. We extend an invitation to formal contact. A delegation will arrive within 3 cycles. Prepare accordingly." The room went silent. Grace looked at me, and I could see in her eyes the same thought running through my own mind. 300 years of silence had just ended with 11 simple sentences, translated by a machine from a species we had never even named. 3 cycles, I repeated. That is not a request. That is a warning. I looked out the window one last time before turning back to my crew, watching the pale light of our dead star reflect off the quiet hulls of our small fleet, a fleet built in secrecy, trained in silence, and now, for the first time in its entire history, about to be tested in the open. "Wake the whole colony," I said finally. "Every household, every station, every child who ever grew up hearing the stories about why we hide. It is time they learned exactly what is coming." Grace nodded, her hand hovering over the system-wide alert. And the delegation, Commander? What do we tell our people to expect? I thought of my grandmother's stories, of the wars that pushed our ancestors from Earth, of the quiet decades spent building a life far from a galaxy that had never once welcomed strangers gently. Tell them, I said, that we are done hiding. Whatever comes through that door in 3 days, we will meet it standing, not hiding in the dark like frightened children. We built this system with our own hands. Whoever is coming to test us is about to learn exactly what that means. Grace pressed the alert, and across every station, every home, every quiet corner of Kalen's reach, the long silence of 300 years finally began to break. 3 cycles felt like nothing at all. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of silver ships and voices speaking languages I did not understand. By the time the delegation's fleet actually appeared at the edge of our system, I had already reviewed every scrap of intelligence we owned about the wider galaxy, most of it centuries old, gathered by our ancestors before they chose to vanish from sight. The delegation arrived exactly on schedule, a single large vessel escorted by 4 smaller ships, cutting through the dark in a formation that looked almost ceremonial. I stood on the observation deck of my flagship, the Wanderhome, watching their approach on the main display, my arms crossed tightly to keep my hands from shaking. Their lead ship is transmitting a formal request to dock, Grace said from beside me. They are calling themselves the Concord, some kind of governing coalition representing several species. Do we know anything about them? I asked. Only fragments, she said. Old records mention a coalition by that name, one that expanded rapidly a few centuries ago by absorbing smaller frontier worlds under trade agreements that quietly became something closer to control. I felt a chill at that description, remembering the very reason my ancestors had chosen silence over exposure. Grant docking clearance, I said, but keep our fleet at full readiness behind the asteroid line. I want them to see hospitality, not weakness. The Concorde's shuttle descended into our main bay an hour later, sleek and polished in a way that made our own utilitarian station look rough and unfinished by comparison. I walked out to meet them personally, flanked by Grace and Elder Hartman, who had insisted on being present despite her age. The delegation that stepped off the shuttle was unlike anything I had imagined. 3 different species stood together, each one moving with practiced synchronization, as if they had spent years perfecting the choreography of first meetings. Their leader, translated through a small device clipped to their collar, introduced themselves with a name that sounded something like Vesic. "Greetings," the translator's flat voice announced, while Vesic's actual voice beneath it clicked and hummed in a rhythm I found strangely beautiful. "We represent the Concord Assembly. We were surprised to find a colony of your scale hidden this deep in unclaimed space." "We were not hiding from anyone in particular," I said carefully, choosing my words the way Elder Hartman had coached me the night before. "We simply valued our privacy while we grew." Vesic's attention shifted slightly, and I noticed the way their gaze moved across our station's structure, cataloging details, measuring us silently even as they spoke pleasantly. "Your defenses are impressive for a colony absent from any registry. May I ask how a group with no recorded contact with the wider galaxy managed to develop technology of this caliber?" "Necessity," Elder Hartman answered before I could speak, her voice calm and steady despite her age. "When you build alone, you learn quickly, or you do not survive at all." Something in Vesic's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the look of someone recalculating an assumption. I filed that reaction away carefully, sensing it might matter later. The formal talks that followed took place in our largest meeting hall, hastily prepared with borrowed furniture and careful lighting meant to project calm confidence rather than the nervous energy actually running through every person in that room. Vesic's delegation sat across a long table from myself, Elder Hartman, and 2 other council members, while translators hummed quietly between every exchange. "The Concord Assembly governs trade, security, and diplomatic relations across a significant portion of charted space," Vesic explained. "Colonies discovered outside our registry are typically offered integration for their own protection and prosperity. And if a colony chooses not to integrate, I asked. Vesik's translator paused for a fraction longer than usual before answering. Unregistered systems occupying strategic or resource-rich territory are sometimes reassigned under frontier provisions to ensure stability across the wider region. The room went quiet. I understood exactly what those careful words meant, dressed up in diplomatic language meant to soften something much harsher underneath. Our system, our home, was being politely described as available for the taking, unless we agreed to hand ourselves over willingly first. This system belongs to the people who built it, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger rising in my chest. We have survived here for 3 centuries without the Concord's help. We do not require your protection now. Vesik studied me for a long moment, and I could not tell if the expression beneath that alien face was amusement or irritation. A bold position for a fleet of this size to hold, they finally said. I would encourage your council to reconsider before formal proceedings begin. What proceedings? Elder Hartman asked sharply. Under Concord frontier law, any system left unclaimed and undeclared for longer than a standard century may be surveyed and, if deemed strategically valuable, formally annexed for the benefit of the wider assembly, Vesik explained, as though reciting something memorized long ago. Your system qualifies under every measure we have observed so far. I felt the weight of that statement settle over the entire room. 300 years of careful silence, patient growth, and quiet survival, reduced to a single bureaucratic clause designed to justify taking whatever the Concord decided it wanted. You are telling us, I said slowly, that because we chose privacy instead of exposing ourselves to a galaxy that has clearly shown it swallows smaller worlds whole, you now believe you have a right to claim everything we built. Vesik did not deny it. The Assembly believes structure benefits everyone. Unclaimed territory invites conflict. Formal integration prevents that conflict before it begins. Elder Hartman rose slowly from her seat, her old frame steady despite her years. 3 centuries ago, our ancestors watched younger, smaller worlds absorbed under exactly this kind of language. That is precisely why we chose to disappear rather than be seen. It seems very little has changed. The room fell into a heavy silence. I watched Vesik's expression shift again, that same subtle recalculation I had noticed earlier, as though our resistance was an unexpected variable in an equation they had assumed was already solved. But I must inform you, a survey and pacification fleet has already been authorized in anticipation of this meeting. In the event negotiations proved unsuccessful, it is currently 3 days from your system's border. My chest tightened. You came here already planning to take this system by force, regardless of what we said in this room. We came prepared for every outcome, Vesik answered simply, without a trace of shame in their translated voice. It would be wise for your fleet to stand down before that force arrives. Resistance against a properly authorized Concord fleet rarely ends favorably for the smaller party. The delegation left shortly after, their shuttle lifting away from our bay in the same practiced, ceremonial formation they had arrived in, leaving behind a silence heavier than anything I had felt since the first alarm woke me days earlier. 3 days, Grace said quietly, once the hall had emptied, of everyone except our own people. That is not much time to prepare for a fleet we know almost nothing about. I turned to Elder Hartman, searching her weathered face for some sign of the calm certainty she always seemed to carry. Instead, I found something new there, a quiet resolve mixed with old grief, as though she had always known this day would eventually come. Elder Hartman, I said, what do we do? She looked at me for a long moment before answering, her voice steady, despite everything we had just heard. 300 years ago, our ancestors ran because they believed hiding was safer than standing. Perhaps that was true then, but hiding only delays a reckoning, Daniel. It does not prevent it. Then we fight, I said, though the word felt strange leaving my mouth, heavy with consequences I could not yet fully imagine. We defend, she corrected gently. There is a difference. We built this system with patience and sacrifice, generation after generation, without asking anyone's permission to exist. I will not let it be taken from us, simply because someone else decided our home was theirs to claim. I called an emergency session of the full council that same evening. Every representative from every station and settlement gathered together for the first time in decades. I stood before them, explaining everything Vesic had said, watching fear and anger ripple across faces young and old alike. "We have 3 days," I told them. 3 days before a fleet larger than anything we have ever faced arrives at our border, intending to take what generations of our people worked to build. I will not pretend the odds favor us on paper, but we know this system better than anyone. Every asteroid, every gravity well, every shadow in this debris field belongs to us, learned through 3 centuries of quiet survival. Elder Hartman stood beside me, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Our ancestors chose silence to survive one danger. Now silence itself has become the danger. It is time our children learn that we are not simply people who hid from the galaxy. We are people who built something worth defending, and we intend to prove it. The council's vote came swiftly, almost unanimous, a rare thing among representatives who often argued over matters far smaller than the survival of everything they loved. No more retreating deeper into hiding. No more hoping the wider galaxy would simply forget we existed. For the first time in 300 years, Kalen's reach chose to stand and be seen, whatever the cost that choice might bring. The 3rd day arrived with a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural. I stood on the bridge of the Wanderhome, watching the long-range sensors sweep across empty space, waiting for the moment everything would change. Every crew member around me moved with quiet precision, checking systems they had already checked a dozen times, needing something to do with their hands while their minds braced for what was coming. "Contact," called Owen Bramwell, our sensor officer, his voice tight. "Multiple signatures, entering the outer system boundary. I am counting 40 vessels so far, and the number is still climbing. 40 ships, against our fleet of 8. I had known the numbers would be uneven, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold wave through my chest anyway. I glanced at Grace, who stood rigid beside me, her jaw set with the same determination I had seen in her since the day this all began. "Order every station to full combat readiness," I said, keeping my voice steady even as my pulse hammered. "Activate the outer field. Let them come to us." Over the years, our engineers had transformed the debris field surrounding our dead star into something far more dangerous than it appeared from a distance. Hidden mines drifted silently among the asteroids, disguised to look like ordinary rock. Old relay towers doubled as gravity well generators, capable of bending an approaching ship's trajectory just enough to send it drifting into a collision course it never saw coming. None of it had ever been tested against a real enemy. Today, we would find out if 3 centuries of quiet preparation meant anything at all. The Concorde fleet advanced in a wide, confident formation, clearly expecting little resistance from a colony they had already dismissed as primitive and unprepared. I watched their ships glide across our display, sleek and numerous, moving with the practiced arrogance of a force that had done this many times before against many other worlds. "They are entering the outer belt," Owen reported. "Formation holding steady, no deviation yet." "Let them keep coming," I said quietly. "Grace, signal Lucy's squadron, decoy pattern 7, on my mark." Lucy Hartman, the same young pilot who had recovered the recorded message days earlier, now commanded a small squadron of light fighters, positioned deep within the asteroid field. Her voice came through the calm despite the situation. "Decoy pattern 7 ready, Commander." "Mark," I said. A cluster of small drones launched from hidden positions within the debris field, broadcasting false signatures designed to mimic larger warships. The Concorde's lead formation shifted immediately, redirecting a portion of their fleet toward what they believed was a hidden strike force, exactly as we had hoped. "Their formation is breaking," Owen said, a note of cautious excitement creeping into his voice. 12 ships diverting toward the decoys. "Now," I said, "activate gravity relay 2 and 4. The old towers hummed to life, bending space just enough to catch the diverting Concorde ships in a subtle but powerful pull. I watched on the display as their trajectories shifted, ships that had been moving in tight formation suddenly drifting apart, some clipping against hidden asteroids they never anticipated, others scraping dangerously close to drifting mines disguised among the rocks. The first explosion lit up the display, distant and silent from our position, but unmistakable. Then another. The Concorde's confident advance had turned, in a matter of seconds, into a scrambling attempt to regain control of ships caught in a trap 300 years in the making. Direct hits on 4 vessels, Owen called out, 2 more disabled by the gravity pull, drifting off course. A cheer rose briefly across the bridge before I raised my hand for calm. "This is only the beginning," I said. "Do not celebrate yet. Their main force is still intact." Indeed, the remaining Concorde ships regrouped quickly, their commanders clearly experienced despite the setback. A larger formation broke off and began advancing directly toward our main fleet position, weapons charging, clearly done underestimating whatever tricks we had left. "Incoming fire," Grace called. "All ships, evasive pattern Delta," I ordered. "Return fire on my command." The Wanderhome shuddered as the first wave of enemy fire streaked past us, close enough to rattle the hull plating. Our pilots, trained for years on simulations but never in true combat, responded with a precision that made my chest swell, with something between pride and fear. Ships that had spent their entire service patrolling quiet asteroid fields now danced through live fire with the same steady hands their training had built. "Return fire," I called, and our own weapons lit up the darkness, streaking toward the advancing Concorde ships. The battle that followed felt like nothing I had prepared for, despite years of drills and simulations. Ships flashed and burned in the dark, comm channels filled with overlapping voices calling out damage reports and enemy positions, and through it all, I kept my focus fixed on the larger strategy, refusing to let the chaos pull my attention away from the plan we had built. "Commander, 3 of our fighters are pinned near the second asteroid cluster," Grace reported. "Lucy's squadron, taking heavy fire." My chest tightened. "Redirect 2 cruisers to support her position. Do not lose that squadron." The minutes that followed stretched impossibly long as I waited for confirmation, watching the display where small icons representing real people, real lives, blinked and flickered under enemy fire. Finally, Lucy's voice crackled through the comm, breathless but alive. "Squadron intact, Commander. Cruiser support arrived just in time. We are pulling back to regroup." Relief washed through me, brief and fragile, quickly replaced by the next demand of the battle unfolding around us. The Concorde's numbers were still overwhelming on paper, but their confusion in the debris field had cost them more than ships. It had cost them the certainty they walked in with, and I could see it in the way their formations grew more cautious, more hesitant with every passing minute. "Their main flagship is pulling back from the front line," Owen reported, "redirecting reserves toward our left flank. They are trying to flank us through the thinner asteroid density," Grace said, studying the display. "If they get through there, they bypass most of our defenses." I studied the map for a long moment, remembering every drill, every late night spent memorizing the exact contours of this debris field with my father, long before I ever imagined actually needing that knowledge in true combat. "Signal every remaining fighter squadron to converge on Sector 9, I said. "We meet them there, in the narrowest channel of the field. Their larger ships will struggle to maneuver." The Concorde's flanking force entered Sector 9, expecting an easy path through, only to find our remaining fighters waiting in a channel too narrow for their larger vessels to properly maneuver. What followed was less a battle and more a slow, grinding collapse of their advance, ship after ship struggling against tight corridors of rock, while our smaller, more agile fighters picked apart their formation from angles they could not easily defend. "They are retreating," Owen called out finally, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Commander, the Concorde fleet is pulling back, all remaining ships withdrawing toward the system boundary." I stared at the display, watching the remnants of a fleet that had arrived with such overwhelming confidence now scattering into a hasty, disorganized retreat. 3 centuries of quiet preparation, patient defense, and careful sacrifice had held against a force that outnumbered us 5-1. "Hold position," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of tension. "Do not pursue. Let them leave." The bridge fell into a stunned, exhausted silence as the last of the Concorde ships crossed back over the system boundary, disappearing into the dark space beyond our defenses. Grace turned to me, her face streaked with sweat and relief. "We held," she said quietly, almost as if she did not fully believe it herself. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened settle over me. The losses we had suffered, mixed with a strange, unfamiliar pride I had never expected to feel this strongly. For 300 years, the galaxy had never known we existed. Today, we had shown them exactly what happened to those who assumed silence meant weakness. But as I looked out at the drifting wreckage scattered across our once quiet debris field, I understood something else as well. This victory would not go unanswered. The Concorde had lost a battle, but a coalition that size would not simply accept defeat and walk away. Whatever came next, our long silence was truly over now, and there was no going back to the shadows we had once called home. The medical bay was full for 3 straight days after the battle ended. I walked its corridors each morning, forcing myself to look at every face, every bandaged limb, every quiet grave marker being prepared in the small memorial garden outside the eastern dock. We had won, but victory had never felt so heavy before. 42 of our people did not survive the battle. I knew most of their names, having trained beside many of them, having grown up alongside their families in a colony small enough that everyone eventually crossed paths with everyone else. Among the dead was Noah Fenwick, a young engineer who had helped design the gravity relay systems that turned the tide of the entire battle, killed when his cruiser took a direct hit while covering Lucy's squadron during their retreat. I stood at his memorial service, listening to his mother speak through quiet tears about a son who had spent his whole short life dreaming of a day when hiding would finally end, never imagining the cost of that day would include his own life. I said nothing during the ceremony, unable to find words that felt adequate for a loss that large, but I carried his name with me afterward, a quiet promise that his sacrifice would mean something more than grief. Elder Hartman found me afterward, standing alone near the edge of the memorial garden, staring out at the same stars that had once hidden us so completely. "You did well, Daniel," she said quietly. 42 people are dead," I answered, my voice rough. "I am not sure well is the word I would choose. No commander who cares ever feels like victory justifies loss," she said gently. "But that feeling, uncomfortable as it is exactly what keeps a leader honest. Do not lose it, even as the difficult days ahead demand harder choices." She was right about the difficult days. Within a week, our long-range sensors detected new activity at the edge of the system. Not another fleet this time, but something far more subtle and, in some ways, more dangerous. Concorde trade vessels began appearing along routes we had quietly used for generations, broadcasting formal notices declaring our system under economic restriction, citing our supposed aggression against a peacekeeping force as justification. "They are trying to strangle us slowly," Grace said during an emergency council session, studying reports of disrupted supply lines and blocked trade routes. "If they cannot take the system by force, they intend to make survival here difficult enough that we eventually surrender anyway. And it will not stop with economics," Elder Hartman added grimly. "The Concorde will also work to shape how the wider galaxy views us. We defended our home, but they will call it something else entirely." She was right about that too. Within days, fragments of Concorde broadcasts reached our intercepted channels, painting our defense of Kalen's Reach as an unprovoked assault against a lawful peacekeeping mission. Other worlds within Concorde territory, worlds we had never met, worlds that knew nothing about us beyond what the Assembly chose to tell them, began referring to us as a violent, unstable colony that posed a threat to regional stability. "They are rewriting the story before we even have a chance to tell our own version," I said, watching one such broadcast translated and displayed on our council screen. "Then perhaps it is time we told it ourselves," Elder Hartman said, a spark of something sharp entering her tired eyes. That single sentence became the foundation of everything that followed. Our ancestors, in their centuries of quiet observation from the shadows, had gathered far more than simple survival techniques. They had also gathered records, intercepted communications, old historical archives detailing exactly how the Concord Assembly had expanded across the centuries, absorbing smaller worlds not through peaceful integration, as their public messaging claimed, but through exactly the kind of coercive frontier provisions we had experienced firsthand. Grace led the effort to compile everything into a single, carefully organized broadcast, drawing on decades of quietly gathered intelligence our people had never before dared to use. Old testimonies from refugee ships that had passed near our hidden system generations ago, records of entire smaller colonies that vanished from galactic registries after resisting Concord integration, patterns too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. "If we release this," Grace said, reviewing the final compiled archive with the Council, "there is no taking it back. The Concord will see it as a direct challenge, not just to their military authority, but to their legitimacy across the entire region." "They already see us as a threat," I said. "The only question now is whether the rest of the galaxy sees the truth of what that coalition actually is, or only the version the Concord wants told." The Council's decision took less time than I expected. Within a single evening, we prepared and released the compiled archive across every open channel our old, careful listening stations had ever mapped, broadcasting not just to Concord territory, but to every independent world, an unaligned system our ancestors had quietly observed over 3 centuries of careful watching. The response was not immediate, but it was profound. Within days, smaller factions long overshadowed by Concord influence began reaching out through cautious, unofficial channels. A trade collective from a distant cluster called Varanth sent a brief message expressing quiet solidarity, claiming they too had experienced pressure from Concord frontier provisions decades earlier, though they had never dared speak of it openly for fear of retaliation. Then came a message from a species I had never even heard mentioned in our old records, calling themselves the Ithrian Compact, a coalition of 3 smaller worlds that had resisted Concord integration a full century earlier, only to watch their economy quietly strangled, much the same way ours now faced. "We are not the first to face this," Elder Hartman said quietly, reading through the growing collection of messages arriving through our comm systems. "We may simply be the first, in a very long time, willing to speak about it openly, backed by enough strength to survive the Concord's immediate response." I felt something shift within me as more messages arrived over the following weeks, a slow, cautious network of contact forming between worlds that had spent generations believing themselves entirely alone in facing an organization far larger and more powerful than any single system could challenge on its own. The Concord did not remain silent through any of this. Formal complaints were lodged through whatever diplomatic channels still technically existed, demanding retraction of what they labeled false and inflammatory claims. A second, smaller fleet appeared briefly at our system's edge, though this time it withdrew after only a few tense days, apparently unwilling to risk another costly engagement while so many independent worlds now watched our system closely, waiting to see what would happen next. "They are hesitating," Grace observed during one strategy session. "The archive changed something. They cannot simply erase an inconvenient colony anymore without the rest of the galaxy noticing exactly how they operate." "That does not mean they have given up," I said. "It only means they are choosing a different kind of pressure for now." That pressure came in the form of continued economic restriction, propaganda broadcasts, and quiet diplomatic maneuvering designed to isolate us from any potential allies before those relationships could properly form. Yet for every effort the Concord made to paint us as dangerous and unstable, our own broadcasts, paired with growing testimonies from other affected worlds, slowly chipped away at the narrative they had spent centuries carefully building across the region. I spent long nights during this period speaking directly with representatives from these newly connected worlds, learning about their own histories, their own struggles beneath Concord influence, discovering that our supposedly isolated colony had, without ever intending it, become something of a rallying point for smaller factions who had quietly resented Concord dominance for generations but lacked the strength or unity to challenge it openly before now. "We never set out to become a symbol," I said to Elder Hartman one evening, watching yet another cautious message arrive from a distant, unfamiliar system requesting further contact. "No one who becomes one ever does," she replied gently. "Symbols are rarely chosen. They are simply recognized, after the fact, by people who needed something worth believing in." I thought about Noah Fenwick then, and the 41 others who died defending a home most of the galaxy had never even known existed a month earlier. I thought about how their sacrifice had rippled outward far beyond anything any of us could have predicted, touching worlds we had never met, inspiring courage in people who had lived for generations believing resistance against the Concord was simply impossible. Whatever came next, whatever further pressure the Concord chose to apply, I understood now that Kalen's Reach could never simply retreat back into the silence it once called home. We had been seen, we had been tested, and against every expectation, we had not only survived, but had begun, quietly and unexpectedly, to change the balance of an entire region of the galaxy that had gone unchallenged for far too long. 6 weeks after the battle, a single unmarked shuttle requested emergency docking clearance at our outer station, broadcasting no formal Concord markings, only a simple request for private, off-the-record talks. I almost refused it outright, wary of another trap after everything we had already survived, but something in the message's careful, almost desperate tone convinced me to allow it through under heavy escort. The passenger who stepped off that shuttle surprised me more than any battle ever had. It was Vesic, the same delegate who had first delivered the Concord's ultimatum months earlier, though they looked different now, tired in a way that seemed to cross species entirely, weighed down by something heavier than simple diplomatic fatigue. "I am not here in an official capacity," Vesic said quietly, once we were seated alone in a small meeting room, far from the larger council chambers. "What I say today does not carry assembly authorization." "Then why come at all?" I asked, studying them carefully, unsure whether to trust anything about this sudden, unofficial visit. "Because the assembly is fracturing," Vesic admitted, their translated voice carrying an odd note of something close to relief. "Your archive did more damage than perhaps even you intended. Smaller factions within the Concord itself are questioning leadership decisions that have gone unchallenged for generations. Some are quietly reaching out to systems like yours, seeking alternatives to an assembly they no longer fully trust." I sat back, processing this information carefully. "You are saying our resistance did more than simply protect our own system." "I am saying," Vesic replied, "that the Assembly's leadership is now deeply divided over how to handle your colony going forward. Continued aggression risks further fracturing internal support, yet backing down entirely, after such a public defeat, threatens their authority over every other system they currently control." "And what does that mean for us?" I asked. Vesic hesitated, choosing their next words with obvious care. "It means an opportunity exists, right now, while internal division still weakens their resolve, for your colony to negotiate terms far more favorable than anything the original delegation ever intended to offer." I brought this information immediately to Elder Hartman and the full council, and within days, formal communication channels opened once again between Kalen's Reach and the Concord Assembly, though this time, the tone of every message carried a weight entirely different from the confident ultimatums we had received months earlier. The negotiations that followed stretched across nearly 2 months, filled with careful language, difficult concessions, and moments where talks nearly collapsed entirely under the weight of old grievances neither side seemed ready to fully release. I sat through most of these sessions personally, alongside Elder Hartman and a rotating group of council representatives, watching as the Concord's tone slowly shifted from thinly veiled threats toward something closer to genuine, if reluctant, respect. They are proposing full recognition of our sovereignty over the entire system, Grace reported one evening, reviewing the latest draft agreement with visible disbelief, including formal reparations for the invasion and an open acknowledgement of unlawful aggression under their own frontier provisions. They would never have offered that a few months ago, I said, reading through the document carefully myself. A few months ago, Elder Hartman reminded me gently, the rest of the galaxy did not yet know what happened here, or what the Concord truly is beneath its polished diplomatic language. Fear of further exposure is doing what our small fleet alone never could have accomplished on its own. The final agreement was signed nearly 3 months after the battle that started everything, a formal document recognizing Kalen's reach as a fully sovereign system, free from any future Concord claims, alongside a substantial reparations package intended to help rebuild what the invasion had damaged. It felt strange, signing papers that formally acknowledged something we had always known to be true, that this system belonged to the people who had built it with their own hands across 3 careful centuries. Yet the most significant change following the settlement had little to do with formal documents at all. Within weeks of the agreement's announcement, ships began arriving at our station from worlds we had never met, carrying diplomats, traders, and curious travelers eager to finally meet the colony that had quietly stood against an assembly many of them had long feared challenging themselves. I remember the day the first delegation from the Ithrian Compact arrived in person, 3 representatives stepping off their modest transport with an eagerness that reminded me strongly of my own excitement as a child, listening to stories about a galaxy beyond our hidden system. They toured our defenses, our quiet residential districts, our small but growing memorial garden, asking questions with genuine curiosity rather than the calculating assessment Vesik's original delegation had carried months earlier. "You built all of this in complete isolation," their lead representative said, studying our modest but efficient station architecture with evident admiration, without any outside guidance or established trade networks. "Necessity taught us quickly," I answered, echoing words Elder Hartman had once used in a very different conversation. "When you have no one else to rely on, you learn to rely entirely on each other instead." Over the following months, similar visits became increasingly common. Small trade agreements formed with independent worlds who had spent generations avoiding Concord influence. Cautious alliances built not through pressure or coercion, but through genuine mutual interest between systems that finally recognized shared history in each other's quiet struggles against the same overwhelming coalition. Lucy Hartman, promoted following her performance during the battle, took charge of a new training program designed to help prepare pilots from these newly allied worlds, sharing tactics and techniques our own people had developed through generations of careful, isolated preparation. I watched her one afternoon, standing in our main training bay, patiently explaining gravity relay principles to a group of eager young pilots from at least 3 different species, all listening intently to lessons born from centuries of quiet human ingenuity. "It is strange," Grace said, standing beside me as we watched the training session from an observation window. "A year ago, most of these people did not even know we existed. Now they are learning our tactics, walking through our stations, becoming something close to friends." Strange, I agreed, but not unwelcome. Elder Hartman passed peacefully in her sleep, nearly a year after the settlement was finalized, having lived long enough to witness the beginning of everything she had spent her final years fighting to protect. Her funeral drew representatives from nearly a dozen worlds, each one paying respect to a woman most had never personally met, yet whose quiet courage had rippled outward to touch lives far beyond anything she likely imagined when she first insisted we stand rather than hide. I stood at her memorial afterward, much as I had stood at Noah Fenwick's service nearly a year earlier, though this time surrounded by faces from worlds our ancestors had never even known existed. Grace stood beside me, now serving as the colony's newly appointed representative to the growing coalition of independent systems that had slowly begun forming in the aftermath of our defiance against the Concord. "She would have liked this," Grace said quietly, gesturing toward the diverse crowd gathered in quiet respect. All these different worlds, standing together because of something that started right here. She always said, "Symbols are recognized, not chosen," I replied, remembering her words from that difficult evening months earlier. I think she became exactly that kind of symbol herself, without ever intending to. Nearly 2 years after the battle that changed everything, I found myself standing once again on the same observation deck where I had first watched the Concorde delegation's shuttle depart, in cold, dismissive certainty. The view had changed considerably since then, where once only our own modest fleet drifted quietly against the backdrop of our dead star. Dozens of ships now moved steadily between docking stations, representing worlds from across an increasingly connected region of independent systems. Below the observation window, in the main plaza that had once served simply as a quiet gathering space for our small, isolated community, a new banner now hung alongside the simple flag our ancestors had carried from Earth centuries earlier. It bore the emblem of the newly formed Independent Systems Coalition, a loose but growing alliance of worlds that had each, in their own way, resisted Concorde dominance and found strength in finally standing together rather than remaining scattered and afraid. Lucy approached quietly, standing beside me at the window, now a senior training officer, respected across nearly every allied system within the coalition. "Cadets from 6 different worlds this term," she said, a note of quiet pride in her voice. Half of them had never even heard of humans before last year. "And now?" I asked. "Now they argue over whose homeworld makes better food during meal breaks," she said, smiling slightly. "It feels remarkably normal, considering everything that brought us here." I smiled at that, thinking about how strange this moment would have seemed to me only a few years earlier, standing anxious and uncertain, watching a single unfamiliar scout ship at the edge of a system we had spent 3 centuries desperately trying to keep hidden from exactly this kind of attention. My grandmother's stories about old Earth had always ended the same way, with humanity forced into hiding, choosing patient silence over the risk of being erased entirely by a galaxy that valued strength over fairness. For 300 years that choice had kept us alive, quiet, and safe within the shadows of an unremarkable dead star system nobody else cared to survey. But safety, I had learned, was never quite the same thing as truly living. Our ancestors had been right to choose caution, when caution was the only option strong enough to protect a fragile, struggling colony. Yet standing here now, watching ships from a dozen different worlds move freely through space that had once existed solely to hide us from a hostile galaxy, I understood something Elder Hartman had tried to teach me long before I fully grasped its meaning. Hiding preserved us for 3 centuries. Standing, however frightening that choice had initially seemed, was what finally allowed us to truly begin living, not simply as a colony desperately avoiding attention, but as a people willing to be seen, tested, and ultimately respected by a galaxy that had once assumed our silence meant weakness. I looked out at the old flag, worn but proudly displayed beside the emerging coalition's banner, and thought of every name we had lost along the way, each sacrifice woven permanently into everything this system had since become. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whatever new pressures an increasingly connected galaxy might eventually bring, I understood clearly now that Kalen's reach would never again retreat into the isolated shadows that had once defined its entire existence. We had been found, tested, and nearly erased entirely by a coalition that assumed hidden strength meant nothing at all. Instead, in trying to take everything from us, the Concorde had unintentionally given humanity something it had not truly possessed in over 3 centuries, a genuine place among the stars, earned not through quiet hiding, but through the courage to finally stand, be seen, and prove exactly what 300 years of patient, determined preparation could accomplish when finally tested. The dead star still burned quietly behind our station, unremarkable as it had always been, yet forever changed by everything that had happened in the space surrounding it. I remained there a long while, watching new ships arrive from worlds our ancestors never knew existed, understanding finally and completely that the long silence of Kalen's reach had not simply ended. It had transformed into something far greater than any of us had ever imagined possible.